My name is Estella Mae Patterson, and I'm 73 years old. I've been through a lot in my life, but nothing, and I mean nothing, prepared me for what happened 3 years ago. It started with a simple surgery, a routine procedure my doctor assured me would be quick and straightforward. How wrong that turned out to be. Not because of the surgery itself, but because of what it revealed about the people I trusted most. Let me take you back to that Tuesday morning in March. It was a cool morning, and I remember my daughter Rebecca calling to check on me one last time before we left for Presbyterian Memorial Hospital. She worked as a pharmaceutical sales rep, always busy, always running between appointments. Her husband, David Chen, had offered to drive me to the hospital for my knee replacement surgery. I thought it was kind of him, really. Maybe more than kind. He wasn't exactly the thoughtful type, if I'm being honest. David had married Rebecca 11 years ago. In that time, I'd learned he was the kind of man who measured his worth by what he owned, what he made, and who he could impress. He drove a Mercedes, not the luxury kind, just the middle one he'd somehow convinced himself showed success. He wore expensive watches and talked incessantly about his consulting business, this firm called Chen Analytics that occupied the 15th floor of the Patterson-Blackwell building downtown. I'd never mentioned to him where that building actually came from or who it really belonged to. The surgery was scheduled for 8 in the morning. David picked me up at 7, driving too fast through the neighborhood like he always did. The hospital was about 20 minutes away, and I spent the entire ride listening to him talk about himself, his latest deal, some client he'd landed, how his business was going to explode next year. I nodded and smiled, asked the right questions. I'd become very good at that over the years. When we arrived at Presbyterian Memorial, David helped me out of the car and walked me to the entrance. The autumn breeze carried that particular smell of hospitals, sterile and sad all at once. I was nervous about the surgery, if I'm honest. I'd never had anything more serious than my appendix removed, and I was 72 years old. The human body starts falling apart around then, and you can't do much about it. "I'll be in the waiting room," David said, kissing Rebecca on the cheek when she arrived to meet us. She'd managed to rearrange her schedule, bless her heart. She hugged me tight and whispered, "You're going to be fine, Mom. You're the strongest woman I know." The surgical staff took me back around 8:30. The anesthesiologist, a kind woman named Dr. Morrison, explained everything in careful detail. I signed the consent forms with hands that shook just a little bit. Then the world went black. I woke up 7 hours later in the recovery room, and something was wrong. My leg throbbed with a pain that didn't match what the nurse said a routine knee replacement should feel like. They kept me in recovery longer than expected, monitoring my vitals, running tests. By evening, I still hadn't gone to my room. They suspected I'd had a minor reaction to something during surgery, and they wanted to watch me overnight. By Wednesday morning, my leg had swollen to nearly twice its normal size. The infection had begun to set in. The doctors would later explain that it was a staph infection, an incredibly rare complication that occurred in fewer than 1% of cases. I'd won the lottery, except the prize was 7 weeks in Presbyterian Memorial Hospital. By the afternoon of Tuesday, after the surgery, David was gone. Rebecca was there, sitting beside my bed, holding my hand. When they first told us about the infection, I could see the worry in her eyes, but also something else, something like disappointment, not in me, but in him. "Where's David?" I asked groggily, still heavy with anesthesia. Rebecca bit her lip. He said he had an important client meeting. He had to get back to the office. I nodded. That was David. Always had to be somewhere more important. But Rebecca didn't leave. She stayed through Wednesday, through Thursday, missing her own work. It wasn't until Saturday morning that David came back, not to visit me, but to tell Rebecca he couldn't hang around the hospital anymore. He had deals to close. Business didn't stop just because I was lying in a hospital bed with an infection spreading through my leg. The weeks blurred together. Rebecca was there most days, sometimes bringing flowers or books I was too tired to read. David came twice in 7 weeks. Once on a Tuesday evening, when he stayed for 14 minutes before checking his watch and announcing he had to handle something urgent. The other time was to pick me up when I was finally discharged on May 3rd, and even then he complained about having to reschedule his afternoon. During those 7 weeks, something shifted inside me. I had a lot of time to think, lying in that hospital bed, watching the IV drip, watching my daughter sacrifice her own life to be there for me. I thought about choices I'd made, about the life I'd built, about what I'd left behind for my daughter to manage. My husband, Thomas Patterson, had died 15 years ago. He was a brilliant man, not brilliant in the way David thought he was brilliant, but truly brilliant. He'd been a developer, a businessman with vision. When he died, he left me his properties. The Patterson-Blackwell building was the crown jewel, a 16-story commercial property in the heart of downtown that brought in nearly $450,000 in annual rental income. There were others, too. A small office complex in Midtown, 3 apartment buildings, a strip mall. Thomas had built an empire, and he'd left it all to me, with careful instructions to diversify, to hold on, to never let it go because it was security for our family's future. I'd never told David that I owned any of this. My accountants managed it, my lawyers handled everything, and I kept the details private. I had no reason to burden my daughter's marriage with the knowledge that I was wealthy, actually quite wealthy. I'd learned from Thomas that money talks, and sometimes it talks people into things you don't want them to do. So when David started treating me like I was in the way, like my needs were an inconvenience, like I was just an elderly mother-in-law to be managed around his schedule, I said nothing. I paid my bills with my Social Security. I lived modestly. I didn't flaunt anything, and I watched him work his business out of the 15th floor of a building that had my name on the deed. 3 months after I came home from the hospital, I called my lawyer, Robert Castellano, who'd been handling my property since Thomas died. We met in his office downtown, which had a perfect view of the Patterson-Blackwell building. I want to evict the tenants on the 15th floor, I told him, sitting in the leather chair across from his mahogany desk. Robert looked up from his papers, confused. Is there an issue with Chen Analytics? They've been reliable tenants. Their lease was just renewed 6 months ago. There's an issue, I said, but it's not a business one. I explained everything to Robert, the hospital, the abandonment, the 7 weeks that David didn't care enough to spend more than 14 minutes at my bedside. I told him about my daughter's worried face, and the way David had started making snide remarks about my recovery, suggesting I should try harder to get around, as if will alone could fix a staph infection. Robert listened carefully. When I finished, he removed his glasses and studied me over his desk. "You're sure about this?" he asked. "It's not a decision you should make in anger." "I've had 3 months to think about it," I said. "I'm not angry anymore, Robert. I'm just making a decision. The question is, Can we do this legally?" Robert smiled then. It was the smile of a man who'd represented me for 15 years and understood exactly why I was doing this. Their lease has a 30-day termination clause for non-compliance with building regulations. The fire suppression system in that section needs to be upgraded. We could require the upgrade at their cost, make it part of the lease compliance. If they refuse, we have grounds to terminate. "How long would that take?" I asked. 3 months, maybe 4 if they drag their feet, longer if they hire their own lawyers. "But Estella, we have documentation requirements on their side. They would need to upgrade to current code. It's not something they can fight, not really. It's a safety issue." So we set it in motion. The building inspector came and documented several code violations in the fire suppression system on the 15th floor. Official notice was sent to Chen Analytics, citing the violations and requiring compliance within 60 days or face lease termination. The upgrade would cost them approximately $75,000. David threw a fit. He called Rebecca, furious, convinced that the building owners were trying to push him out so they could raise rents on a new tenant. He threatened to hire lawyers. He complained about frivolous regulations and crooked landlords. He had no idea. I watched my daughter's face when she tried to explain that the building owners had every right to enforce their own safety standards. I almost told her then, but I waited. I wanted to see what David would do next. He tried to negotiate with the building management company that handled day-to-day operations. They told him to take it up with the owner. He sent emails demanding to know who owned the building. The management company, of course, knew exactly who owned it, and they simply explained that the owner wished to remain private, but was fully committed to all fire and safety code compliance. When David insisted on speaking to the owner directly, he was told that wasn't possible, but any concerns could be relayed through formal channels. By week 6, David was panicking. The cost of the upgrade had grown in his mind into some kind of conspiracy against his business. He was working late, stressed, taking it out on Rebecca. She called me one Thursday evening, worried about him, worried about their finances. David was convinced they might have to move the business, that this was going to ruin them. That's when I decided it was time. I invited Rebecca to lunch at a quiet restaurant near my house. She came on a Saturday, still concerned about David's stress, but trying to maintain some normalcy. We ordered our food, and after the waitress left, I reached into my purse and pulled out a document. A copy of the Patterson-Blackwell building deed with my name on it, dated 15 years back. Rebecca's face went white. She stared at it like it was a hologram, some kind of trick. "Mom," she whispered, "how long have you—" "Since your father died, sweetheart. He left me the building and several others. Thomas was a businessman, a very successful one. I've never made a point of it because it didn't matter to your life, but it's mattered to mine." Rebecca's hands shook as she held the document. "You own the building where David's office is?" "I do. For 15 years, I've been the owner of record. And 3 months ago, on the advice of my lawyer, I instructed the management company to require the fire suppression upgrades." Rebecca sat back in her chair, and I watched understanding wash over her face. She started to cry, but not sad tears. Tears of release, maybe, or anger at her own husband, or relief that her mother wasn't as helpless as David had convinced her she was. "Does David know?" she asked. "Not yet. That's going to be your decision, Rebecca. How you handle this, what you tell him, that's not my call. But I want you to understand something. I didn't do this to hurt him. I did this because for 7 weeks, while I lay in a hospital bed fighting an infection, he couldn't be bothered to sit with me. He abandoned you to take care of me alone. And since then, he's shown both of us, that we're not worth his time. Rebecca cried harder, and I reached across the table to hold her hand. The reason I'm telling you is this. David has a choice. He can upgrade the fire suppression system like everyone else in that building does, or he can move his business elsewhere. But his comfort is not my responsibility. My responsibility is to you and to my own integrity. Rebecca told David the truth 3 days later. I only know because she called me afterward, her voice tight and controlled. He's furious, she said. He thinks you did this to punish him, to prove some kind of point. He's threatening to sue you. For what? I asked gently. For enforcing building code violations? For being the property owner? David did try to sue. His lawyer sent threatening letters to Robert's office. But there was nothing to sue for. The fire suppression violations were real, documented, and required by code. His lease gave the building owner the right to enforce those codes. After 3 months of expensive legal fees going nowhere, David's lawyers advised him to cut his losses. In the end, he paid for the upgrades. $75,000 came out of Chen Analytics' operating budget. It hurt him, but it didn't destroy him. What destroyed him, what really damaged something in his life, was the knowledge that he'd been wrong about me, that I wasn't the soft, easy, dispensable mother-in-law he'd treated me like, that I had resources, power, and boundaries. When Rebecca and David came to my house for dinner 6 months after the upgrades were complete, something had shifted in their marriage. Rebecca was quieter around him, more distant. She'd started seeing a therapist. David was careful, almost formal when he spoke to me. He'd stopped making dismissive comments about my recovery, stopped suggesting I was weak or fragile. Rebecca moved into an apartment downtown by the end of that year. The divorce was finalized 14 months after that hospital stay. She still works in pharmaceuticals, though she's transitioned to a management role with better hours. She brings her new partner, a woman named Carol, to my house for dinners now. Carol is kind to me, asks genuine questions about my life, helps me in the kitchen without being asked. David kept his office in the Patterson-Blackwell building. He upgraded the fire suppression system, paid his rent, and never tried to contact me again. Last I heard, through my lawyers, his business started struggling about 2 years in, not because of the building or the upgrades, but because of his own choices, his own character. The building didn't push him to succeed or failure. It was just a building, in the end. But it was mine. I'm telling you this story because I spent 71 years being the kind of woman who kept her power quiet. I let my husband's accomplishments define me, and then, when he died, I let his absence define me. I let my daughter's husband treat me like a burden, and I didn't stand up for myself until I had no choice. I let fear of disrupting my daughter's marriage keep me silent about his cruelty. But here's what I learned in that hospital bed, fighting an infection, facing my own mortality. You don't get to opt out of your own life. You don't get to be invisible just because it's easier. And the people who truly love you, the ones who matter, They don't need you to be meek or quiet or self-sacrificing. They need you to be whole. So if you're watching this and you see yourself in my story, if you're the person who's been told you're in the way or too much or too needy, I want you to know something. Your needs matter. Your safety matters. And your voice, when you finally use it, is louder than you could ever imagine. I'm Estella May Patterson, and I've learned that sometimes the most powerful thing you can do is own what's already yours.